And now we come to our speaker. This is Professor Hilary Rose. And I think you describe yourself as an academic and an activist. And British, but hostile to your country's history of imperialism. Interested in and committed to struggles and liberation. And you're also a feminist, and you were Green of Commons. So far away.
I thought talking about my academic CV was not very interesting. But thank you, my chair, and my profound apologies to everyone. It was a very serious traffic problem, and London will throw its worst at you sometimes. Now, following Alas and two of the speakers, both quite fascinating, I found myself thinking, particularly when you were talking about how war is really, when politics fail, it's got nothing going for it, particularly if you are a woman with children. It's a marvellous book by a man called Gil Elliot, and it's called The 20th Century Book of the Dead. What he talks about is the kill in wars. And in the First World War, and I mean there are many, many wars, but I'm just remembering these three. In the First World War, the great majority, around 90%, were soldiers. And we know those terrible gravestones and the graveyards of Europe filled with dead. 1939-45 was rather different. That, roughly speaking, 50% of civilians were killed, but primarily women and children and older men, and 50% soldiers. We get a very different feel about the politics of those two. I mean, if you're being bombed and you're being occupied, and the whole context is different. Contemporary kinds of wars, the kill ratio has slipped completely. It's now, roughly speaking, or many of them, it's about 90% civilians and 10% soldiers. And if you look at some of the figures of, for example, the kill level in the Israel army is using on civilians and the fighters in Palestinian fighters, then that kind of kill figures you could easily sort of deconstruct those and work out it would be roughly along that side. So I want to say we're talking about modern war, and we're trying to use this very difficult word, terrorism. And I want to just play that a little in all its savagery. Because I'm young, when in 1939-45, they were called the resistance, and they were terrorists according to the Germans. They blew things up, they killed people, and occasionally even their own side got killed because of their activities. And certainly the Germans slaughtered whole villages, as we know. They slaughtered women and children. And many French argued that the resistance caused these problems, and that if they'd only kept quiet, these killings would not have been so many. So resistance, terrorism, another word that we have, it's popped up now. I see that those who were called often Taliban or are increasingly becoming insurgents, as I listen to them in the press. So there's another word for you, rising up. Then we've got guerrillas, usually associated with struggles for colonial freedom. And then we've just got plain freedom fighters. Language is very, very powerful. People are, to a great extent, how you name them. So the words that we choose will, to some extent, indicate what options are open to us and what are shut down, simply by the language we use. So I, for example, try to avoid words like terrorist, as it seems to me just too loaded, and it closes down conversations before they have been even begun. And it does mean that choosing words becomes very, very difficult. Now, I've long been interested, as I say, and very deeply committed to struggles for colonial freedom. I think any person who is as English as I am should be. Now, you learn about that partly because you actually understand what it means to be an imperial, part of an imperial power. Remember, I was brought up when the map of the world was virtually all pink. You know, now it brings into you, it teaches you that you are superior, and you're superior over everyone. And you take this advantage for granted. It's like being white. You're invisible because you're white, because white is other people are coloured, but you're white. You have no colour. And as a white member of an imperial power, you do grow up pretty smug. And it takes an awful, and actually, let's be blunt, racist. So you grow up, and you take a whole lot of things for granted, and you have to unlearn those things. But I thought we were very nicely hearing from you, Kat. But this unlearning is usually, it's not a private thing, it's a collective thing, it's a shared thing, it's all the kinds of things that other people have been talking about. But my interest as a feminist is how we build a different kind of civil society. The old civil society that we had was a civil society of men. And men were not only in the state, in government, or in the army, as we heard so eloquently. They were the state, they controlled the armed force of the state, they controlled the houses, rape was legal for husbands, violence was legal for husbands. It was a horrible, horrible patriarchal world. We're crawling out of that in some countries, in some places. And we hear some of that in conversations we're listening to. But what I want to say is that this project of trying to make civil society more open to women is difficult, slow, and hard. I mean, if you're dealing, for example, I work a lot with the feminist academics at Birzeit University in Palestine. Now, we both regard war and military activities, whether of guerrillas, terrorism, as totally counterproductive. It will get nowhere in the Middle East. The only option against that sort of violent approach to let us call it, solving problems or land grabs, is actually to build civil society so that it can move away from both the corruption of the PLO and Fatah and the bizarre sort of fundamentalism of Hamas. So that's much more sophisticated than it used to be. But my hope is that it is civil society which will expand and strengthen. Now, if you're on the receiving end of a war, that is one of the most difficult things to do, especially in the middle of the war. And you were talking about, Courtland came in about building bridges, but this is after the conflict. I'm talking about my interest in how do you try and build civil society while the conflict is raging? What can we do? Now, I became involved in something, indeed, as a found a movement, and I'm sure horrified some of you. I'm involved in the academic boycott of Israel, profoundly involved in it. And I do that because I see it as one of the few ways of helping Palestinians build their civil society to strengthen them. And I take that as enormously seriously. And for me, it's absolutely essential that there are feminists and feminist men amongst the group that I work with. Because, and it really isn't that we're naturally nicer people as women. I mean, the point is so eloquently made. It is simply that, as feminists, we have different views of the world. We understand about coming from below in a situation of oppression. We can make alliances. We have to be very skilled and careful with working with one another. We're working across divides of religion, non-religion, different religions. There are many gaps to work across. And of course, there's always my dreadful past of being this terrible British imperialist sort of sitting there that I've got to watch out about. But what I think about the academic boycott is this. People say, oh, if you're boycotting the Israelis, surely you stop this important dialogue. Not a bit of it. I've had more discussions with Israelis than I've ever had in my entire life. And I think that this argument does help shift them, because you're actually criticising their society, not just because of its terrible violence, because it's so racist internally. I mean, it's stratified like apartheid with all its layers of, real whites, Indians, and sort of down to the blacks at the very bottom. And Israel's got so many internal problems that it's not addressing, that to actually, once you start talking with Israeli women who may be very, very angry with you, and you say, well look, there are real problems. And you begin, just as you were saying, you start having a real conversation. And once there is a real discussion, and actually it is perfectly possible for people to scream at one another and then have a real conversation,